Colin Cotter from Imperial College, London, and he will talk about the compatible finite element methods for numerical weather prediction.
Okay. Thanks for the introduction, Antonella. So for this talk, I have cheated in two different ways. So the first way I've cheated is that my topic was introduced by Nigel Woods, so I can avoid lots of introductory slides, which helps a lot. The other way I've cheated is that, so I'm talking about my sort of collaboration as an academic with an external user, but the Met Office is a very special place, so it's like a kind of like a combination between a research lab and a sort of a business that's providing forecasts. And so lots of people there are very highly mathematically trained and very mathematically curious, and also willing to, you know, recognize that they need to find out what's going on amongst academics in mathematics to benefit them for a lot. So in particular, Nigel, when I've spoken to him, has always been very willing to sit down and talk about D's and wedges and Hodge stars in a way that most industrial collaborators probably wouldn't be so excited by. So I'm very fortunate in that regard. So I'm just going to talk a little bit more about the finite element methods that Nigel introduced and how we use them to build models in geophysical fluid dynamics. So to begin with, yeah, so the title I'm using this term, compatible finite element methods. So in fact, compatible finite element methods are just the same thing as this term that was already introduced earlier by Elena, which is the finite element exterior calculus. I just tend to use this term because when I'm speaking with collaborators, I like, apart from with Nigel, I like to keep things in vector calculus instead of differential geometry, because it just can make it a bit more accessible. So all compatible finite element methods mean is finite element exterior calculus, but always just writing it in vector calculus instead. So I'm happy to move between both. Right, so what is the idea? So as Nigel mentioned, the way that these finite element methods are built up, the way that finite element spaces are built up, is you think about these fundamental vector calculus identities, like in this case, the divergence of curl is equal to 0. So you can take a scalar function over here, and then this is the 2D version of this structure. So you can take a scalar function over here, and then you can take its gradient and rotate it, and that produces a divergence-free vector field. And so we can think about all of the vector fields, velocity fields that live here, and then we can also take the divergence, and then we get the scalar functions that live over here. And the idea is if we take the gradient, this curl, and then take the divergence, then we get 0, i.e. the kernel of this operator is includes the image of this one. So this is called a de Rham complex. You've got these operators that move from one set of functions to another in a way that their kind of ranges and kernels map onto each other in some appropriate way. So divergence maps from here to here, here to here, curl maps from here to here, and the curl maps onto the kernel of the divergence in this space here. So that's the fundamental vector calculus identity which we're trying to preserve at the discrete level. So all you do is you just find subspaces of functions which are going to be finite dimensional, and in practice these functions are piecewise polynomials on some kind of mesh. And the idea is that so then you have a finite element, a set of finite element functions. You can take the curl, you get divergence-free vector-valued finite element functions. You can take the divergence and get 0. So here, excuse me. So we're labeling these 3 spaces V0, V1, V2 is the appropriate points on this discrete version of this de Rham complex. And then for everything to behave nicely, you need the existence. I mean, we don't use them much in algorithms usually, apart from some special cases. You need to know that there exist some projections that go from spaces of all possible functions that you can curl down to my finite element set of functions which I'm going to take a curl of, and then another projection going from all the possible vector fields that I can take a divergence of down to this finite element space where my finite element vector functions are going to live, and another one from where the divergences are going to be down to my finite element space of divergences. And so the point is that this whole diagram needs to commute. So you can either project a function, take a curl, or take a curl, then project, and you get the same thing. Or you can take a divergence of a function, then project, or project and then take the divergence, and then the whole diagram commutes. So it needs to commute. And then there are some analytic requirements on these projections as well. They need to have some upper bound, and they need to map onto the entire of these spaces. And so if we have this, then these three finite element spaces play together in a nice way. And so there's a nice accessible book that Doug Arnold has recently had published in SciAm. We've currently got a reading group on it, Imperial, to get some of our students and postdocs into sort of learning about all the various different aspects. So this is a nice place to look, and it has all the references of most of the results that I'm using. Okay, so so let's actually look at some examples of what these finite element spaces look like. So the simplest one is if we think about triangles. So one of the meshes of the globe which Nigel drew was this icosahedral grid where you take an icosahedron, subdivide it into more and more triangles, and then just puff it out to this sphere. So triangles are a nice way. It's nice to triangulate things. So if you have, so in each triangle, the idea is that you're going to describe the functions as a polynomial, and then you're going to have some continuity requirements between the triangles in order to define the functions everywhere. So these functions are going to describe the pressure, the velocity, temperature, density, etc., that are the physical fields in the model. So in this setup, so one example you can have is in each triangle you have functions which are quadratic as a function of x and y, and they're also continuous between between the triangles. So you can arrange that by making sure that you store the value of the function at these node points, as we call them, and then because we've got 3 points, that defines a quadratic across here, and therefore the function will be continuous on the other side. If you take a curl of one of those functions, so you take the gradient, rotate it by 90 degrees, then you get something which is linear. So it makes sense to choose our velocity fields to be linear vector fields, so vector valued linear functions in each triangle. And then so we arrange things so that now we need to have just enough continuity in order to take a divergence. So now we're just not going to say that the whole functions are continuous between triangles, but they're vector valued, so just their normal component, i.e. the component normal to each face, needs to be continuous from one triangle to another. And it turns out that is satisfied by a particular finite element space that's Brezzi, Douglas, Marini 1. So Donatella Marini is the M. She was mentioned by Elena earlier. And then that's just enough continuity to take a divergence. So if you take a divergence of a linear function, then you get a constant one. So the functions that live over here are completely discontinuous. We don't use any continuity to take any more derivatives. And they're constant in each cell. Okay, so that's a example of a famous sequence of compatible finite element spaces. And then you can glue them together in this way. So I mentioned that you can ensure continuity by saying that the values at the vertices and the edge centers are shared for this quadratic functions. Similarly, the value so I forgot to mention that the vector valued functions, we store their normal component at each end of each edge. So it's linear. So a scalar linear function has 3 numbers that describe it. So a vector valued one needs 6. And then these 6 numbers are the normal components on the 3 edges. And that ensures that we can nail down the normal component as a linear function on each edge. So then we just make sure that if 2 triangles share an edge, then the function has the same normal component in between each of the triangles along that edge. You just have to agree which direction the normal points. And then the discontinuous functions don't need to have any continuity at all. Okay, so that's a famous example of this discrete de Rham complex. which satisfies the right projections and so on. There's some other ones. So this is the one that is being used in those, well, the 3D version of this is what's being used in those, that finite element water world simulation that Nigel showed. So if you have quadrilaterals, then you can't make things linear. You have to use bilinear. So it's the project, it's the, all of the basis functions are the product of a function of x and a function of y. And then there's a space here which describes, it's somewhere between linears and constants, vector fields with continuous normals which are constant along each edge. Then if you take a divergence, you get something that's completely constant function and discontinuous between the cells. So it's the same idea. So you can build them in, so you can build these things in triangles, you can build them in quadrilaterals, you can also increase their order, so you can make higher order discretizations. So on quadrilaterals and on triangles, there's an entire infinite family of different orders. So if you want to make your method more accurate, then you can increase the order of the polynomials there. So this is a related family. I thought I was going to have some higher order ones for triangles as well, but I've removed them from this slide. Okay, so that's more or less the idea. So we're dealing with functions of various different types, which are polynomials in each cell with some amount of continuity which allows these different differential operators to move between them. And it can be shown that these projections exist, computing bounded projections of the right sort. Okay, so why are these things interesting for geophysical fluid dynamics problems? Well, it really comes down to this. So if you have a velocity field and it's super smooth, so you can differentiate it as much as you like, then you can write in 2 dimensions. You can write that velocity field as the skew gradient of a stream function, which is a scalar field. So this is a divergent part. And you can, so I'm talking about at the continuous level, so ignore all these deltas, which mean that it's an approximation. And then you can plus a gradient of a potential, so that's the divergent part, plus a harmonic function. So harmonic functions are things which are divergence-free and also curl-free. So at the, and so this is very important because in geophysical fluid dynamics at large scale, then flows are almost completely divergence-free, and so the kind of the part we associate with the slow motion of the weather is this kind of divergence-free part here, and also the harmonic functions perhaps, and then there are waves over the top which are small in amplitude, which are associated with this part here, the part that's a gradient, and the coupling between them on the large scale flow, where there's the Coriolis effect is significant, is quite weak. And so it means that you just get this slow evolution of the divergence-free part with the gradient part just kind of oscillating somewhat over the top. And so if you're not careful at the discrete level, if you discretize the equations, you can end up making this coupling stronger, and then the slow evolution of the large scale part of the flow kind of leaks waves, and eventually you just kind of see waves everywhere, and the forecast is not of good quality. So it turns out that the discretization that's on this latitude-longitude grid that Nigel showed, that's used in the Met-Office dynamical core, at the linear level, it has a decomposition like this, a finite difference version of it, and that is what's keeping this correct weak coupling between the slow and the fast stuff. And so it's something that you'd like to preserve if you go to a finite element method. So what actually happens is, so the really great thing is that if you've got this discrete de Graaff complex, what it gives you is this Helmholtz decomposition at the discrete level. So it means if you take any velocity field from this space of this finite element space of velocity fields, then it can be written uniquely as the skew gradient of a stream function, where the stream function is now from this V0 space that I showed you, and something like a gradient of a potential. So the potential is now from V2, which is discontinuous, so you can't compute the gradient of those functions. But what you can do is compute an approximation to the gradient by applying integration by parts. and that defines this grad twiddle here, which is like a weak approximation of the gradient. And then there are we also have harmonic forms in V1, which are things which are divergence free, and they have a weak approximation of the curl that's also 0 as well. And the important thing is that there's the same number of these harmonic forms as there are in the undiscretized setup. So, and that just depends on the topology of this space. So on this space, so on the sphere, then in the continuous equations, there's no harmonic forms. So if your discretization creates some, so I do know discretizations that can create harmonic forms spuriously on the sphere, then you get weird stuff going on in the numerics that you don't want to see. On the periodic plane, then there's a two-dimensional space of harmonic forms, and then you want to make sure that your discretization also has a two-dimensional space of harmonic forms, and that's guaranteed by this Helmholtz decomposition from this discrete de Rham complex. So it's really cool. So what it does is there's some kind of topological result about the dimension of harmonic forms at the continuous level that's preserved at the discrete level as well from the setup. And that turns out that that's exactly what we need to make sure that we don't get this spurious coupling between slow stuff and fast stuff. Okay, so so maybe that's, so if you've never seen compatible finite element methods or finite element exterior calculus before, that's the main thing that you can take away, that we get this property at the discrete level. And so the main thing you could take away is that if you, in general, if you don't have this special structure in the discretization, you won't have this decomposition into divergence-free and divergent stuff that's important for maintaining the slow, balanced flow that you see in the real, in the solutions in the geophysical fluid dynamics. Okay, so that's that. So let's talk a little bit more about how we use these finite element spaces to model some geophysical fluid dynamics. And so when we look at geophysical fluid dynamics and we're just deriving new discretizations, we like to go back to a simpler model, which is called the shallow water equations, where you just have a horizontal, so it's like it models a thin layer of fluid where the horizontal horizontal velocity is independent of the depth, and then there's h is the height of the fluid that has a surface that's moving up and down like the surface of the sea. So it turns out this simplified model already incorporates quite a bit of the dynamics that you see in more complicated three-dimensional models in this kind of large-scale setup. So, and here I'm actually looking at the linear level as well. So we've got an equation for the velocity. This is the time derivative of the velocity. There's a Coriolis term, so this perp symbol means you just rotate the velocity by 90 degrees. So this is the effective rotation of the Earth. And then there's g, which is just the acceleration due to gravity, grad h, where h is the height of this surface. If the surface goes up, that increases pressure and then pushes out the fluid. So this is essentially the momentum equation. Then there's a continuity equation for the height, which is the law of conservation of mass. So the total amount of fluid going in has to be balanced by the raise in the height. And so we see dh dt plus h naught, which is the mean depth of the fluid multiplied by the divergence of u equals 0. So this is a linear set of equations. And then so it turns out that we can isolate this slow and fast motion from these equations. So in fact, in these equations, the slow motion is actually steady. So that's about as slow as you can get. So what happens is that if you have a divergence-free velocity field, then dh dt is equal to 0. Then you can find an h such that the Coriolis exactly balances the pressure gradient, and that's called geostrophic balance. And that's a principle which underpins the motion of the large-scale flow, especially at mid-latitudes, like we are here in Cambridge. And then, so if this term balances this term, then du dt is also 0 as well. So you've actually got completely steady solutions. And then on the top of that, the other solutions are oscillating waves. And so, okay, so I spent a lot of time talking with Andrew Staniforth and Nigel about what properties they require about discretizations, and John Thubone as well. And the main properties as can be explained at this linear level here, correspond to making sure that this pressure gradient behaves nicely, which means that you don't want to have oscillatory functions which when you compute their gradient numerically you get small values. And so that's called the inf-sup condition. This is like a kind of classical thing about these kind of compatible finite element discretizations. You also want that this steady state property holds exactly at the discrete level. If it doesn't hold exactly, what it means is that this steady state will leak waves and gradually get eroded. And then when you introduce nonlinearity back into the system, this steady state becomes something that's slowly evolving instead of completely steady. And that needs to be maintained by having this balance being approximately satisfied. And finally, you want to avoid inertial oscillations, which are spurious. So inertial oscillations are where you have the height is flat, the flow is just a constant, and then everything is just moving around like this. So it turns out that this can be controlled by the compatible finite element discretization as well, and this can be controlled exactly by those harmonic functions having the right dimension. Okay, so I've got lots of other things because I've just imported this from a slide, so we can talk about, we don't have time to talk about energy conservation, I think. So I'll just kind of jump in and show some pictures right at the end, or I can show you some mention some kind of extensions. So for nonlinear shallow water, we've looked at variational discretizations. We've looked at ways to conserve quantities through a discrete Poisson bracket. This has been extended to mimetic spectral elements, which is another form of high order. It's also been extended to splines as well, so lots of other people are kind of picking up these ideas as well. And then in 3 dimensions, we did things with frontogenesis, various lowest order spaces which are being used in the Met Office, efficient solvers. Most recently, we've added moisture to the equation. So maybe I'll just quickly show you some pictures that relate to something that's more weather looking. So here's a picture from these frontogenesis tests. So this is a vertical slice through the atmosphere, and you can see, so this is actually velocity. So you've got the colours, blue means going into the board, red means coming out, and then what's happening is it's forming a front. So this is a simplified model of how fronts form in the weather. So we can simulate those things. And then very recently, we've just started to develop how to put moisture into the model. So this relates to choosing which finite element spaces things to go in these big stuff. This is actually a 3D baroclinic wave simulation. So here you're looking at a horizontal slice through the 3D, and you can see that there's these waves which are appearing on a jet. This is a vertical slice at a particular point in Y, and you can see more. This is now rain concentration. You can see rain falling out of the clouds, and then this is a temperature perturbation on the same slice, and this is what the velocity perturbation is doing in this structure. So we've compared this against other simulations from other models of this particular phenomenon, and they look very good. Okay, so maybe just kind of summarize. So we like compatible finite element spaces because they have this discrete de Rham complex which gives us this Helmholtz decomposition, and that gives us exactly correct coupling between slow and fast waves in the linearized system, and also in the nonlinear system as well, but that's sort of analysis of that is something that's kind of ongoing. And you can get, I didn't really have time to talk about it, you can ask me about it later, but you can also build the nonlinear equations, you can build them so they conserve energy and entropy using this Poisson brackets. And so there's lots of extensions which are innovating this kind of structure preserving nature of the methods, as well as making practical simulations work as well. And that's the end.
Thank you. Barely time is too short to talk about everything.
Yeah.
So, very fast question. Elena.
You don't talk anymore about semi-Lagrangian methods. There are no semi-Lagrangian methods anymore in the picture, or are they?
So Nigel mentioned he showed a slide where he was talking about this kind of swept methods which would be compatible with semi-Lagrangian, but I've not been developing them within my framework. You can't make energy conserving methods with semi-Lagrangian, for example. So that's one reason I was less interested in.
The energy preserving methods, how do you do that? Just quickly.
You take the Poisson structure and then you discretize it. So you just take the Poisson brackets and then so it doesn't. So it's the thing that you lose when you discretize it is it doesn't satisfy the Jacobi identity anymore. So it's almost Poisson.
Okay, so hopefully people would be able to ask
Okay, thank you.